Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today, I continue bringing you the story of Hoài and Hung, a story that begins on a very ordinary, peaceful evening, just before everything suddenly takes an unexpected turn. That evening, the small kitchen was filled with the warm glow of yellow light. The soft illumination rested gently on the simple dining table, on the freshly prepared dishes still steaming, and on the familiar faces that had grown close after so many days of living together. The atmosphere was quiet and calm, carrying a rare sense of safety after a long stretch of busy days. Hoài stood by the stove, carefully arranging the bowls and chopsticks, adjusting the placement of each dish out of habit. Her movements were neither hurried nor slow, but carried the ease of someone deeply connected to this kitchen. From time to time, she glanced toward the dining table, where Hung sat across from Tony. Hung ate while casually making a few light-hearted remarks. His voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to make the dinner feel warmer and more intimate. Tony sat quietly, his small hands neatly placed on the table, his clear eyes following every movement of the adults. The boy didn't speak much, but through his gaze and subtle reactions alone, one could feel the gentle warmth of his presence. It was a rare moment of peace. No one said it out loud, but all three of them were savoring it, a simple dinner, a small kitchen, and the feeling that time itself seemed to slow down. Until the silence was broken. The phone lying on the table suddenly vibrated. The sound wasn't loud, yet in the stillness of the room, it felt unusually sharp. Hung paused slightly, glanced at the screen, then quickly picked up the call. From the very first seconds with the phone to his ear, his expression began to change. After only a few words from the other end of the line, Hung's face shifted completely. The faint smile from moments earlier vanished, replaced by visible tension in his eyes. His hand tightened around the phone, his shoulders stiffening as if he were forcing himself to stay steady. Lytutieu, on her way back from selling vegetables, was hit by a car. She's in emergency surgery at the hospital. The fragmented words fell heavily into the once warm space. Hoài froze, the chopsticks in her hands stopping midair. She stood motionless for a brief moment, as if her heart had been tightly squeezed. A chill ran down her spine, leaving her no time to think. Only seconds later, Hoài placed the chopsticks down and stood up. Her eyes met Hung's directly. She didn't ask questions, nor did she need further explanation. Everything she needed to know was already written on his face. No one said another word. The atmosphere in the kitchen grew heavy. Tony sat on his chair, looking up at the adults with confusion, sensing the sudden change but unable to understand what was happening. Hung quickly made a call to send Tony to a nearby acquaintance's house. His instructions were hurried and brief, filled with undisguised worry. Hoài grabbed her coat and followed him, and the two of them rushed out of the familiar house, heading straight for the hospital in the night. The emergency room was flooded with cold white light. When Hoài and Hung arrived, CEO Hoài was already there. He stood leaning against the chilly hallway wall, his back straight but his shoulders tense. Exhaustion and anxiety were etched clearly across his face, his reddened eyes never leaving the tightly closed doors of the emergency room. Each time the door stirred as someone went in or out, his gaze immediately followed, only to fall again in disappointment when the door closed once more. Little Ivy, Lytutien's young daughter, had been taken home by Hoài mother to be cared for. The decision was made quickly, allowing the adults to focus entirely on the emergency unfolding behind those doors. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood. It was the only way to reduce even a small part of the chaos at that moment. 3 people stood in the hospital hallway. 3 uneven breaths intertwined. No one could remain still for long. Hung paced back and forth. Hoài stood silently in one spot, her hands tightly clasped together. CEO Hoài continued leaning against the wall, his eyes never leaving the emergency room door. Time passed with suffocating slowness. Each second, each minute felt endlessly stretched, leaving behind only silence, the cold white lights, and the heavy worry hanging in each of their hearts. At last, the doors of the emergency room swung open. The doctor stepped out, his face clearly marked by exhaustion after hours of intense effort. The white lights reflected off his lab coat, making his presence seem even more solemn. The entire hallway seemed to hold its breath in that moment. The three people waiting immediately turned their eyes toward him. No one dared to blink, and no one dared to speak first. The doctor's voice was low and deliberate. The patient is out of immediate danger, but she has lost a significant amount of blood. She needs an urgent transfusion, and unfortunately, the hospital is currently short of this exact blood type. The words fell into the cold hallway, not loud, yet heavy enough to weigh down every heart listening. Hoài felt her chest tighten. Hung stood frozen, his breathing stalling for a beat. CEO Hoài lowered his head, his hands instinctively clenching, as if trying to hold on to something fragile. There was not a second of hesitation. Almost at the same time, all three spoke at once, their voices overlapping in urgency. "Take my blood." The words came out firm and resolute. No one looked at the others, and no one needed to ask anything further. It wasn't a rash statement, but a natural reflex, people standing at the edge of life and death for someone they loved. The doctor nodded quickly and signaled for the nurses to begin the necessary procedures. One by one, they were called into the testing room. The hallway returned to a state of extreme tension. The air felt stretched tight, so heavy that even the footsteps of nurses passing by made hearts jolt. The distant hum of medical machines echoed steadily, yet inside each person, their heartbeat raced wildly, following no rhythm at all. Hoài sat on a cold chair, her hands resting on her lap, fingers gently intertwined. She stared at the polished floor, trying to steady her breathing. Hung stood a short distance away, his back against the wall, eyes fixed on the door of the testing room. CEO Hoài remained silent, taking a few steps forward, then stopping, unable to find any position that brought even the slightest comfort. Time crawled by. When a nurse stepped out and called Hoài name, she froze for a brief moment, as if she hadn't yet realized that the name being called was her own. She looked up, a flicker of surprise crossing her eyes, then quickly stood. Her blood type was compatible. The announcement wasn't long, but it was enough to draw every gaze toward Hoài. In that moment, she didn't think of herself at all. There was no hesitation, no fear visible on her face. Without needing another second to consider, Hoài nodded and agreed to donate blood directly. The decision was made so quickly that even she didn't fully realize the magnitude of what she had just chosen. To Hoài, it was simply what needed to be done, the only possible choice at that moment. The nurse swiftly guided her forward, each step urgent yet precise. Hung stood outside, watching Hoài figure disappear behind the door. His hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His eyes reddened, his throat tightened, but no words came out. All the emotions swirling inside him could only be seen through his gaze and his faintly trembling breath. CEO Hoài stood still for a moment, then bowed his head deeply. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse with emotion, not directed at anyone in particular, as if speaking to himself, yet filled with overwhelming gratitude and worry. The hospital hallway remained flooded with white light. The door to the transfusion room closed. And the tension in the hearts of those left behind had not eased at all, as they silently waited for each passing second. The blood transfusion was finally over. The door to the transfusion room opened slowly, white light spilling into the hallway as if releasing some of the heavy tension that had filled the air. A nurse gently helped Hoài outside. Her complexion was noticeably paler after the blood loss, yet she tried to keep her steps steady. Before she could say anything, her eyes were already searching for the recovery room, where Tieu was being transferred. Not long after, Tieu was wheeled into the recovery room. Her body lay still on the gurney, her face pale, lips dry, but her chest was now rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The rhythmic beeping of the monitoring machines echoed softly, no longer frantic as before, easing some of the suffocating atmosphere in the hospital hallway. Hoài stood quietly, watching through the glass. In that moment, all the exhaustion seemed to settle onto her slender shoulders. She let out a soft breath, as if releasing the heavy burden that had weighed on her since arriving at the hospital. Her arms dropped unconsciously to her sides, her fingers trembling slightly, yet her eyes never left Tieu. Hung stood behind her, looking at the two most important women in his life, one lying motionless on a hospital bed, the other just stepping out after a blood transfusion. In that instant, every emotion inside him seemed to break free. The worry, tension, and fear he had been holding back until now could no longer be contained. He stepped forward and pulled Hoài into a tight embrace. His arms wrapped around her firmly, not because he was afraid of losing her, but as if letting go might cause everything he had just held on to disappear. His shoulders trembled, his breathing unsteady. Within that embrace, Hoài could clearly feel the surge of emotion in Hung, something he could neither hide nor needed to hide. Thank you for saving my sister." Hung's voice broke halfway through. The words came out incomplete, yet they carried all of his gratitude, sorrow, and the relief he had only just found. He didn't lift his head, as if afraid that one glance at Hoài would make his emotions even harder to control. Hoài remained still in his arms. She didn't pull away, nor did she respond with any grand gesture. She simply placed one hand gently on Hung's back, soft, yet steady enough for him to feel her strength. Her body was still tired, her head slightly light after the transfusion, but when she spoke, her voice was clear. Hoài gently shook her head, her gaze softening as she spoke in a calm but certain tone. "Tieu is my sister too." The words were simple, spoken quietly, yet in the hospital space they felt unexpectedly warm. It wasn't said as reassurance, but as an undeniable truth, something that had long existed in her heart. In that moment, any boundary between your sister and family seemed to fade away. CEO Hoài stood not far away, silently witnessing everything. He didn't step closer, only stood still, his hands clasped together in front of him. His eyes moved from Hoài to the recovery room. In that gaze was deep gratitude, intertwined with guilt and relief, blending together in subtle waves. The hospital hallway remained bathed in white light. Tieu's breathing behind the glass grew steadier. And the people standing outside, though none of them said it aloud, could all feel a subtle shift in the air, as if the storm had just passed, leaving behind a heavy silence, but no longer one of despair. That night, no one left. When all the necessary procedures were finally settled and Tieu was fully transferred to the recovery room, the three of them remained at the hospital. No one mentioned going home. Even though it was already late, even though their bodies were exhausted after a long, nerve-wracking day, none of them was calm enough to leave. For them, the only sense of safety now was standing as close as possible to Tieu's hospital bed. All three took turns staying awake by her side throughout the night. At times, Hoài sat close to the edge of the bed, her eyes never leaving Tieu's pale face. She watched every breath, every subtle rise and fall of her chest, as if afraid that looking away for even a second might change something. At other moments, Hung stood up, paced a few steps around the room, then stopped beside the bed again, his gaze fixed on the numbers blinking on the monitoring screen. CEO Hoài spent most of the time standing at the foot of the bed, his back lightly against the wall, arms crossed as if forcing himself to stay awake. No one slept. No one could truly stay still for long. Even the slightest furrow of Tieu San's brow was enough to startle all three of them. Their eyes met for a brief moment, no words needed, yet each understood the rising fear in the other's hearts. Sometimes, it was just a slightly heavier breath, a small movement of her hand, and the entire room seemed to sink into tension. Those moments followed one another in silence. Outside in the hallway, the hospital remained brightly lit throughout the night. The white light stretched across the cold tiled floor, casting long shadows of the few people passing by. The distant sound of a stretcher rolling away, the footsteps of nurses echoing and fading, everything blended into the familiar nighttime rhythm of a hospital, steady, cold, and never truly stopping. Inside the recovery room, the atmosphere was completely different. There were no long conversations, no noisy gestures. Only the quiet presence of those who stayed. Each person stood in a different corner, in a different posture, yet all shared the same focus, their eyes fixed on Tieu San. The bond between them didn't need words, it existed in every glance, every soft movement of sitting down or standing up, every unbroken watch through the long night. At times, Hoài gently rubbed her hands together, the lingering fatigue from the blood transfusion still present, yet she never complained. Hung thought about urging her to rest more than once, but the words stopped at his lips, because he himself couldn't bring himself to leave the room. CEO Hoài remained silently in place, his gaze lowered, as if trying to memorize every moment, every breath, to remind himself that Tieu San was still here. The night passed slowly. No one knew exactly how much time had gone by. They only knew that outside, the hospital lights never went out, and inside, the three of them stayed right there, sharing the same worry, the same silent waiting, deeper than ever before. How will Tieu San recover after such a serious accident? What other challenges await this family ahead? Stay tuned for the next episode to find out what happens next.